Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What happens when the person you love most calls you from a place they couldn't possibly be? The Florida sun beat down mercilessly as I pulled into our driveway, the asphalt shimmering with heat. Our modest bungalow in Naples looked just as I'd left it that morning, white stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and Elena's prized hibiscus bushes flanking the entrance. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, enjoying the blast of air conditioning before stepping out into the sweltering afternoon. Elena's car was already in the garage. She must have finished her shift at the hospital early. As a nurse in the ICU, her schedule was often unpredictable, but she'd mentioned trying to get home before me today. We'd been planning a quiet evening together, something we both desperately needed after weeks of barely seeing each other. I walked through the front door, calling out, "I'm home." The cool interior was a welcome relief from the oppressive heat outside. In the kitchen, Elena's voice answered, accompanied by the familiar clatter of pots and pans. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the air as I made my way through the house. Elena stood at the stove, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, stirring a pot of what looked like her grandmother's famous pasta sauce. She turned and smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling in that way I'd always found endearing. "Perfect timing," she said, standing on her tiptoes to kiss me. "Dinner's almost ready." Everything seemed normal, comfortingly routine. But as I set my bag down on the kitchen counter, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a text from work. Instead, the screen displayed a notification, "New voicemail, Elena." I frowned, glancing at my wife, who was now chopping basil at the cutting board. "Did you just call me?" She looked up, knife pausing mid-chop. "No, why?" "I have a voicemail from you." Elena shrugged. "Must be a glitch. I've been cooking since I got home." I nodded, but something about it felt off. I tapped the notification, putting the phone to my ear. The message began with static, a low hiss that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then, unmistakably, Elena's voice came through, but different. Strained. Panicked. "Jack, please." Her voice cracked, thick with tears. "It's been 3 days. Where are you? You said you were just going to the store. Please call me back. I don't know what to do anymore." The message ended with a sob that cut straight through me. I stood frozen, my eyes fixed on Elena, my very present, very calm wife, as she hummed softly while stirring the sauce. "What is it?" she asked, noticing my expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard, trying to compose myself. "Nothing," I lied, sliding the phone back into my pocket. "Just work stuff." But as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The message played on loop in my mind, Elena's voice, undeniably hers, filled with a desperation I never heard before. And beneath that, a whisper of something else, the faint sound of waves crashing, the distant cry of seagulls. That night, as Elena slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above our bed. The soft glow of the alarm clock cast shadows across the room, turning familiar objects into looming figures. I couldn't stop thinking about that voicemail. About the Elena on the other end of that call, an Elena who believed I had disappeared, who had been waiting for me for 3 days. An Elena who existed somewhere I couldn't reach. The thought sent a chill through me despite the warm Florida night. I rolled over, watching my wife's chest rise and fall with each breath, reassuring myself that she was here, that we were together, that everything was as it should be. But as I finally drifted towards sleep, a question nagged at the edges of my consciousness: if that Elena was real, what had happened to her Jack? And more disturbingly, what might happen to me? The next morning arrived with the harsh glare of sunshine through our bedroom blinds. I barely slept, tossing and turning as fragments of that voicemail replayed in my mind. Elena had already left for her early shift at the hospital, leaving a note on the kitchen counter, lunch in the fridge. Love you. Ordinary. Normal. As if nothing strange had happened yesterday. I poured myself coffee and tried to focus on the mundane tasks of the day. I had a conference call at 10, reports to finish by noon. Regular life continuing as it always had. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if someone or something was observing me from just beyond my peripheral vision. During my call, I found myself staring out the window at our backyard. The palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting shifting shadows across the lawn. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the pool, just a flash of someone who looked like Elena, watching me through the glass. But when I blinked, there was nothing there except the rippling water reflecting the morning sun. After the call ended, I checked my phone compulsively. No new messages. No new voicemails. I debated deleting yesterday's message, but found myself playing it again instead. Elena's voice, breaking with emotion, begging me to come home. The background noise seemed clearer now, definitely waves, and what sounded like a radio playing faintly in the background. Where are you? She had asked. As if I had simply walked out one day and never returned. As if, in some other world, I had abandoned her. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I would never leave Elena. Not willingly. I tried to work, but my concentration was shot. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind through the trees outside, made me jump. At one point, I could have sworn I heard Elena calling my name from somewhere deep in the house, but when I searched the rooms, I found nothing. Just before lunch, my phone buzzed again. My heart leaped into my throat as I saw the notification, new voicemail, Elena. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. Jack, it's me again. Her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been crying for hours. The police aren't taking me seriously. They say I need to wait 48 hours to file a missing persons report. But I know something's wrong. You would never just leave. Your wallet is still here, your keys, everything. Please, if you get this, just let me know you're okay. The message continued, but now I could hear something else in the background, a television or radio announcer mentioning a tropical storm warning for the Gulf Coast. The same weather we had last week, before the skies cleared and brought the current heat wave. I checked the timestamp on the message, said 2 minutes ago. I immediately called Elena at the hospital. Hey, what's up? She answered, sounding harried but normal. Hospital noises surrounded her, beeping machines, voices on the intercom. Just checking on you, I said, relief flooding through me at the sound of her voice. Busy day? Swamped. Multi-car pileup on I-75. I probably won't be home until late. That's fine, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll wait up. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I had 2 voicemails from Elena, an Elena who believed I was missing, while the real Elena was at work, completely unaware of my growing unease. I began to question my own sanity. Was I imagining these messages? Was this some elaborate prank? Or was something much stranger happening? That afternoon, I drove to the hospital, telling myself I just wanted to bring Elena lunch. The receptionist in the ICU greeted me with a smile. "Jack, what a nice surprise. Elena's with a patient, but she should be out soon." I nodded, trying to appear casual as I scanned the unit. And there she was, emerging from behind a curtain, making notes on a chart. My wife, solid and real, exactly where she was supposed to be. When she saw me, her face lit up with surprise. "Twice in one day. What's the occasion?" I held up the bag of takeout. "Thought you might be hungry." She kissed me gratefully, but pulled away when she noticed my expression. "Are you feeling okay?" "You look pale." "Just tired," I lied. "Didn't sleep well." As we ate lunch in the hospital cafeteria, I studied her face, trying to reconcile this Elena with the desperate voice on my phone. They were the same person, and yet, somehow, they weren't. Driving home, I took the coastal route, watching the calm Gulf waters sparkle in the afternoon sun. The waves lapped gently at the shore, nothing like the stormy background I'd heard in the voicemail. I parked at a public beach access point and walked along the sand, trying to clear my head. That's when I saw it, a flicker in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. But this was different. For just a moment, the beach before me seemed to shift, the clear sky darkening, the calm waters churning. In that instant, I saw a different beach, ravaged by wind and rain, palm trees bending under the force of a storm. And then it was gone, leaving me standing alone on the peaceful shore, the taste of salt and fear on my tongue. That night, I waited up for Elena as promised. When she finally came home after midnight, exhausted from her shift, I held her tighter than usual. "Everything okay?" she murmured into my chest. "Everything's fine," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. Because as I held her, my phone vibrated in my pocket. Another message from another Elena, wondering where I had gone. By the third day, the messages had become a terrible routine. They arrived at odd hours, each one more desperate than the last. I'd started recording them, playing them back to myself when Elena wasn't around, trying to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. "It's been a week now, Jack," the latest one began. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "I found your phone in the garage today. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't leave without it. I'm scared something's happened to you. Really scared." I could hear rain hammering against windows in the background, the low rumble of thunder. The tropical storm that had passed through our area weeks ago was still raging wherever she was. My Elena, the one who slept beside me each night, who kissed me goodbye each morning, remained blissfully unaware of her doppelganger's desperate calls. I hadn't told her. How could I? What would I even say? "Hey, I'm getting voicemails from another version of you from what seems like a parallel universe." She'd think I was losing my mind. Some days, I thought I was too. I'd started noticing other differences between our world and the one in the voicemails. Small things at first, a news headline mentioned on the radio in the background that didn't match our current events, a song playing that hadn't been released here yet. Then bigger things. In one message, Elena mentioned our neighbor Thomas bringing over food, except our neighbor's name was Richard. I became obsessed with these discrepancies, mapping the night in a notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. I was building a picture of this other world, this other life where I had vanished and Elena was left alone. That afternoon, I sat on our back porch, watching the placid surface of our pool reflect the cloudless sky. My notebook was open in my lap, filled with my increasingly frantic notes. I'd started experiencing more of those strange flickers, moments when reality seemed to ripple around me, showing glimpses of that other place. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see our house as it existed there, shutters closed against the storm, yard strewn with palm fronds and debris. Once, I'd even caught a glimpse of her, the other Elena, standing in our kitchen, looking out the window with red-rimmed eyes. I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the real Elena approaching until she placed a hand on my shoulder, making me jump. "Sorry," she said, frowning at my reaction. "Didn't mean to startle you." I closed the notebook quickly. "It's fine. Just working on some ideas." She sat beside me, her expression concerned. "You've been acting strange lately, Jack. Jumpy. Distracted. Is everything okay at work?" "Work's fine," I said automatically. "Then what is it? And don't say nothing because I know that's not true." I looked at her, my wife, my Elena, and felt a surge of guilt. I'd been so consumed by these messages, by this other reality, that I'd been neglecting her. Us. I've been having trouble sleeping, I admitted, which wasn't a lie. Strange dreams. She took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine. "What kind of dreams?" I hesitated. "Dreams where I'm lost. Where I can't find my way back to you." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough. Elena squeezed my hand. "I'm right here," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." That night, as we lay in bed, I tried to focus on her presence beside me, on the reality of our life together. But as I drifted towards sleep, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I waited until Elena's breathing had deepened before carefully reaching for it. Another voicemail. "The police finally took a report," the other Elena's voice said, thick with emotion. "They searched the beach where your car was found. Nothing. It's like you just vanished. Some people are saying you might have gone into the water during the storm, but I don't believe that. I know you, Jack. You wouldn't do that to me." I froze, my blood turning to ice. My car had been found on the beach. I thought of my visit to the shore days ago, the strange ripple in reality I'd witnessed there. "I keep having these dreams," she continued, her voice breaking. "Dreams where you're trying to reach me from somewhere else. Sometimes I wake up and I swear I can feel you in the room with me, just beyond where I can see. Am I losing my mind, Jack? Or are you really trying to come back to me?" The message ended, leaving me in the dark, my heart pounding. She was feeling it too, this connection between our worlds, this thinning of the veil between realities. I got out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Elena, and went to the window. The night was clear, stars visible above the palm trees. But as I gazed out, the view began to shimmer, like heat rising from pavement. For a moment, I saw a different scene, our yard battered by wind and rain, a massive palm tree fallen across the driveway. And there, standing in the yard, looking up at the window, at me, was Elena. The other Elena. Her hair whipped around her face in the storm, her eyes wide with shock. She could see me. Our eyes locked across the impossible distance between worlds, and I felt something shift inside me, a pulling sensation in my chest. Her lips formed my name, a question, a plea. Then the vision was gone, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the glass, shaken to my core. I turned back to look at Elena, sleeping peacefully in our bed. Safe. Whole. Here. But for how long? If I could see that other world, if that other Elena could see me, what did it mean? Was the boundary between our realities breaking down? And if it was, which world was real? Which Elena was mine? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, and beneath them all, a growing fear. What if I was never meant to be here at all? The line between dreams and reality began to blur. I would wake in the middle of the night, unsure of which world I was in, reaching for Elena only to find her side of the bed empty. Then I'd blink, and she would be there, sleeping soundly, unaware of my silent panic. The messages kept coming, growing more frequent, more desperate. They no longer arrived as voicemails, they came as text messages, as emails, once even as a handwritten note I found tucked in my wallet, though I had no memory of placing it there. 2 weeks now, the latest one read. The search has been called off. They think you drowned. I know you didn't. I can feel you, Jack. Sometimes I think I hear you calling my name from another room. Please, if you can hear me, find a way back. I'd stopped going to work, calling in sick day after day. Elena was worried. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she started coming home early to check on me, in the hushed phone calls she made when she thought I couldn't hear. I'm concerned about him, I overheard her telling someone, probably her sister. It's like he's here, but not really here. Like he's slipping away. She didn't know how right she was. The episodes were getting worse, longer periods where I'd see that other world superimposed over this one, like double-exposed film. I'd be sitting in our living room, and suddenly the walls would seem transparent, revealing a storm-damaged version of our house beyond. Furniture moves slightly out of place. Pictures on the walls in different frames. And always, in these visions, the other Elena searching for me, calling my name, walking through rooms I was standing in but couldn't reach. I started avoiding mirrors. Once, while brushing my teeth, I'd looked up to see not my reflection but a window into that other bathroom where the mirror was cracked and the counter cluttered with prescription bottles. Anxiety medication. Sleeping pills. The labels all bore Elena's name. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? Or was something far stranger occurring? I began researching quantum physics, parallel universes, any scientific theory that might explain what I was experiencing. I filled my notebook with diagrams and equations I barely understood, desperate for answers. That's how Elena found me one evening, surrounded by printouts about many worlds interpretation and Schrodinger's cat. My notebook opened to a page where I'd written which world is real, over and over again. Jack, she said softly, as if approaching a wild animal. I think you need help. I looked up at her, my wife, my anchor in this world that increasingly felt like a dream. I'm not crazy, I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. She knelt beside me, placing a hand on my cheek. I never said you were. But something's wrong. You're not sleeping, you're barely eating. You flinch every time your phone makes a sound. Please, talk to me. I wanted to. God, how I wanted to pour everything out to her. But how could I explain that I was being haunted by another version of her from a world where I had disappeared? How could I tell her that I was beginning to wonder if that world was where I truly belonged? Instead, I leaned into her touch, closing my eyes. I'm just going through something. I'll be okay. She didn't believe me. I could tell, but she nodded, pressing her forehead against mine. I love you, she whispered. Whatever it is, we'll face it together. That night, I dreamed of the beach. In the dream, I stood at the shoreline, waves lapping at my feet. The sky was dark with storm clouds, the wind whipping sand against my skin. Across the water, I could see another beach, sunny, peaceful, the one from my world. And I knew, with the certainty that comes in dreams, that I had to choose. That I couldn't exist in both places. That the universe was correcting an error, forcing me back to where I belonged. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. Elena wasn't beside me. The clock read 3:15 in the morning. Elena? I called out, my voice sounding strange in the darkness. No answer. I got up, moving through our house with a growing sense of dread. Each room was empty, still, as if Elena had never been there at all. Family photos on the walls showed only me, standing alone where Elena should have been. My heart hammered in my chest as I reached for my phone. No messages. No missed calls. No Elena in my contacts. This wasn't my world. Somehow, in my sleep, I had crossed over. I ran outside, not bothering with shoes or a jacket. The storm that had been raging in the other Elena's voicemails was in full force here, rain lashing against my skin, wind nearly knocking me off my feet. Elena! I screamed into the storm, but my voice was swallowed by the howling wind. I stumbled down the driveway, barely able to see through the rain. Our neighbors' houses were dark, shuttered against the storm. The fallen palm tree I glimpsed in my vision days ago blocked the road. I needed to get to the beach. I knew that with sudden clarity. That was where I disappeared from in this world. That was where the boundary between realities was thinnest. I ran, barefoot through flooded streets, the rain blinding me, the wind pushing me back. But I pressed on, driven by desperation and the growing certainty that I had to fix what had gone wrong. When I finally reached the shore, the waves were massive, crashing against the sand with violent force. The ocean stretched before me, dark and terrible, nothing like the calm Gulf waters I knew. Elena! I called again, scanning the deserted beach. Had I expected her to be here? Waiting for me at the exact spot where I vanished from her life? A flash of movement caught my eye, someone running along the shoreline, battling against the wind. A figure in a yellow raincoat. Jack. Jack. Her voice carried to me on the wind, and my heart leapt. Elena. My Elena. The one who had been calling me, searching for me, believing in me when everyone else had given up. I ran toward her, my feet sinking into the wet sand. As we drew closer, I could see her face, tear-streaked, disbelieving, hope warring with fear. You came back, she cried as we reached each other, her hands gripping my arms as if afraid I might disappear again. You came back to me. I pulled her close, holding her against the storm. I'm sorry, I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For disappearing? For taking so long to find my way back? For the pain I caused her? Where were you? She asked, her voice muffled against my chest. I thought you were dead. I looked past her, out to the churning sea. In the distance, through the rain and mist, I thought I could see a shimmering, like heat rising from asphalt. A window to another world. A world where another Elena was probably waking up right now, reaching for me and finding only empty sheets. I was lost, I said finally. But I found my way home. The shimmering on the horizon faded, like a door closing. I felt something within me settle, a rightness, a certainty that this was where I belonged. But as Elena led me back to her house, her hand warm in mine, I couldn't help but wonder about that other world, that other life. Had it been real? Or just a dream, a hallucination brought on by whatever had happened to me during the storm? And what of the other Elena? Was she real too? Would she grieve for me, believing I had abandoned her? Or would she simply cease to exist, a potential reality that had never truly been? These questions haunted me as we made our way home through the rain. But with each step, they grew fainter, more distant, like the memory of a dream fading in the morning light. By the time we reached our house, our real house, storm damaged but standing, I could barely remember why I had been so troubled. All that mattered was that I was here, with Elena, where I belonged. At least, that's what I told myself as I stepped through the door, leaving the storm behind. 6 months later, life had returned to something resembling normal. The storm damage had been repaired, our routines restored. Elena and I moved through our days with the practiced ease of a couple who had weathered a crisis and emerged stronger for it. I never told her where I'd been during those 2 weeks I was missing. The doctors called it dissociative fugue, a rare psychological condition where a person suddenly travels away from home and cannot remember their identity or past life. They said it was likely triggered by stress, perhaps combined with a head injury during the storm. It was easier to accept their explanation than to try to articulate what I believed had happened. That somehow, I had slipped between realities, lived another life with another Elena in a world where the storm had never hit. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself questioning which world had been real. Had I truly crossed between parallel universes? Or had it all been an elaborate hallucination, my mind's way of coping with trauma? The memories had faded with time, becoming hazy and dreamlike. I could no longer recall the exact layout of that other house, the specific messages the other Elena had left me. The notebook I'd filled with frantic notes and theories was gone, lost during the storm, or perhaps never existing at all. Elena had been patient with my recovery, never pressing for details I couldn't provide. But I could see the questions in her eyes sometimes, the worry that whatever had taken me from her might do so again. "I'm not going anywhere," I would tell her, wrapping my arms around her. "I promise." And I meant it. Whatever had happened, whatever force had pulled me across the boundary between worlds, I had chosen to return. I had chosen her. We were sitting on our rebuilt back porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. A text message from an unknown number. "I miss you." My blood ran cold. I glanced at Elena, but she was focused on the horizon, unaware of my sudden tension. Another buzz. "I know you're out there somewhere." My hands shook as I typed back. "Who is this?" The response came instantly. "You know who it is, Jack. I never stopped looking for you." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. It couldn't be. That world, that life, that Elena, they were gone, sealed away behind a door I had closed months ago. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, noticing my expression. "Bad news?" I forced a smile, locking my phone screen. "Just work. Nothing important." That night, as Elena slept beside me, I sat in the darkness of her bathroom, staring at the series of texts. They had continued throughout the evening, desperate, pleading messages that echoed the voicemails I'd received in that other world. "Sometimes I think I can feel you nearby. The police think I'm crazy, but I know you're still out there. Please come back to me." I didn't reply to any of them. What could I say? How could I explain to this other Elena that I had chosen not to return to her world? That I had found my way back to where I belonged? But as days passed, the messages kept coming. They began to include details, specific memories of our life together in that other world, things only she would know. Things that confirmed what I had tried to deny, that world had been real. That Elena was real. And she was still searching for me. I became obsessed with the messages, hiding them from my Elena, staying up late to read them, to trace the contours of that life I had left behind. They were like an addiction, a connection to a possibility I had rejected but couldn't fully abandon. And then, one night, she called. I was alone in the house, Elena having gone to visit her sister for the weekend. When my phone rang, displaying unknown number, I knew who it was before I answered. Jack? Her voice was exactly as I remembered, the same as my Elena's, yet somehow different. Marked by grief, by searching, by hope that refused to die. How is this possible? I whispered, sinking onto the couch. I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. I've been trying to reach you for months. Calling, texting, anything I could think of. Most of the time, the messages just disappear into nothing. But sometimes they seem to get through. I close my eyes, imagining her alone in our house in that other world, reaching across the void between realities. Where are you? She asked. What happened to you? How could I tell her? How could I explain that I had found my way back to another version of her, that I had chosen that life over the one we shared? I got lost, I said finally. Between worlds. There is another place, another reality. I ended up there during the storm. Another reality, she repeated, confusion evident in her voice. Another version of our life, I explained. Where the storm never hit. Where you and I were together, just like here, but different. And then I found my way back. Back to here. There was silence on the line, and for a moment I thought the connection had been lost. Then, softly, there's another me? Yes, I admitted. Just like you, but not you. And you chose her. It wasn't a question. I couldn't lie. Not to her. I chose to come back to where I thought I belonged. Another long silence. I could hear her breathing, imagined her sitting in our living room, perhaps in the same spot where I now sat, separated by an impossible distance. I still feel you sometimes, she said finally. Like you're just in the next room. Like if I turn around quickly enough, I'll catch a glimpse of you. I knew that feeling. Even now, months later, I sometimes experience those strange flickers, moments when reality seemed to thin, showing me glimpses of that other world. The boundaries between our worlds are weakening, I said, voicing a fear that had been growing inside me. That's why we can communicate now. That's why I can sometimes see, there. Can you come back? She asked, hope coloring her voice. If you found your way here once, can you do it again? The question hung in the air between us. Could I? Would I, if I could? I don't know, I said honestly. And even if I could, I have a life here now. With her. With me, she corrected, a hard edge entering her voice. Another version of me. But I'm still here, Jack. Still waiting. Still alone. Guilt washed over me. She was right. I had left her, abandoned her, however unintentionally. And now I was choosing to stay away. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. Not as sorry as I am, she replied, her voice cracking. I love you, Jack. I still love you. And somewhere out there, you're living a life with someone who looks like me, sounds like me, but isn't me. Do you have any idea what that feels like? Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there in the darkness, the phone clutched in my hand, tears streaming down my face. When Elena returned home the next day, she found me different, distracted, distant. I couldn't tell her why. How could I explain that I had spoken to another version of her from another reality? That I was torn between two worlds, two lives, two versions of the woman I loved? The calls and texts stopped after that night. Whether the connection had been severed or the other Elena had given up, I didn't know. But their absence left a hollow space inside me, a questioning that wouldn't cease. Had I made the right choice? Was this truly where I belonged? Or had I stolen a life that was never meant to be mine? These questions haunted me as weeks turned into months. I began to notice small differences between this Elena and the memories I had of the other, subtle variations in manner, in opinion, in the way she laughed or frowned or said my name. And sometimes, in unguarded moments, I would catch myself wondering, what if I had stayed there? What if I had never found my way back during the storm? Then, one ordinary Tuesday morning, as I stood in the kitchen pouring coffee, my phone buzzed on the counter. A voicemail notification from an unknown number. My hands trembled as I pressed play, already knowing what I would hear. Jack, her voice came through, clear and steady, no longer broken by tears. I've stopped looking for you. I've accepted that you're gone, whether you're in some other world or simply gone. But I wanted you to know that I'm okay. That I'm going to be okay. I closed my eyes, relief and sadness mingling in my chest. If you can hear this, she continued, if you're out there somewhere with her, I hope you're happy. I hope you found what you were looking for. And I hope that somewhere, in some other world, there's a version of me who gets to be with you. Who gets to grow old with you. Who never has to know how it feels to lose you. The message ended, leaving me standing in the kitchen, frozen in place. The coffee pot overflowed, hot liquid spilling across the counter, but I barely noticed. Who was that? Elena asked, entering the kitchen in her nurse's scrubs, hair still damp from the shower. I set the phone down slowly, trying to compose myself. No one, I said. Just a wrong number. She gave me a curious look but didn't press further, moving to clean up the spilled coffee. I watched her, my wife, my Elena, and felt a surge of love so intense it was almost painful. This was my life now. This was my reality. Whatever had happened during that storm, whatever doors had opened between worlds, I had made my choice. That night, I deleted the voicemail and blocked the unknown number. It was time to let go, to commit fully to the life I had chosen. But as I lay in bed, Elena sleeping peacefully beside me, I couldn't help but wonder about the nature of reality, of choice, of fate. Had I truly crossed between parallel universes? Or had it all been some strange psychological break, a fabrication of my traumatized mind? I would never know for certain. And perhaps that was for the best. I drifted towards sleep, my thoughts growing hazy. On the edge of consciousness, I heard my phone buzz on the nightstand. Just once. A text message. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. I knew what it would say, knew it was the final echo from that other world, a world I had left behind. Goodbye, Jack. As I slipped into dreams, I imagined doors closing throughout the universe, pathways sealing themselves shut, realities separating once more, the natural order reasserting itself. And somewhere, in a world very much like this one, I pictured another Elena moving on with her life, learning to live with the mystery of my disappearance, perhaps even finding happiness again. I hoped she would. I hoped that whatever strange cosmic error had allowed me to slip between worlds, to live two lives simultaneously, would grant her that much at least. In the morning, when I checked my phone, there was no message. No missed call. No trace of that other world. Just this one. Just us. And for now, that was enough. Have you ever looked beneath the surface and seen something looking back? The floodwaters have receded from most of Oak Ridge, but our little pocket of Oklahoma remains submerged, an accidental lake where Main Street used to be. I volunteered for the recovery team because this town had been my home for 34 years. They needed people who knew the layout, who could identify which watery mound was the pharmacy and which was the hardware store. Pete Lawson captained our flat-bottomed aluminum boat, navigating slowly through what used to be intersections. I sat at the bow with my clipboard, marking buildings we checked on our waterlogged map. The morning sun cast golden light across the flood surface, almost making the devastation beautiful. Thompson's place should be coming up, I told Pete, pointing toward a rippling patch of water ahead. Family of 4. They evacuated early, thank God. The kids with the treehouse? Pete asked, his voice oddly subdued. I nodded, remembering the elaborate wooden structure the Thompson boys had built with their father last summer. The top of it might still be above water. That's when I first noticed something off. A shadow moved beneath us, too large to be a fish, too fluid to be debris. I leaned over the edge of the boat, peering into the murky water. Hey, Jim, where are you? Pete started, but his voice trailed away as he saw it too. Below us, perhaps 15 feet down, a human silhouette walked casually along what would have been the sidewalk. It moved with purpose, as if on a morning stroll, utterly unaffected by the crushing weight of water above it. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks. When I looked again, the figure was gone. Did you see that? I whispered, my throat suddenly dry. Pete's knuckles had gone white on the tiller. Just some trash moving with the current, he muttered, but his eyes kept scanning the water. We continued in silence, the only sound the gentle purr of the outboard motor and water lapping against the hull. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, the flood depths more ominous. As we approached the remains of the Thompson house, I noticed dark shapes moving behind what was once their living room window. Humanoid figures drifting back and forth as if carrying on with ordinary household routines despite being underwater. Pete, I said, my voice cracking slightly. Cut the engine. The motor died, and we drifted in perfect silence over what had once been the Thompson family's front yard. I could now clearly see a figure inside, moving from the submerged window to what would have been their kitchen. It moved like Mrs. Thompson, with that slight limp from her hip surgery last year. That's not possible, Pete whispered beside me. A chill ran up my spine as the underwater figure paused, then slowly turned toward our boat. Through the murky water, I could make out the vague features of a face, Mrs. Thompson's face, looking up at us with empty, dark eyes. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. The Thompsons were safe at the Red Cross shelter in Tulsa. I'd seen them myself 3 days ago. This couldn't be them. Yet beneath us, the figure raised an arm in greeting, as if welcoming us to their home. Pete yanked the starter cord with trembling hands. "We need to report this," he said, his voice thin and reedy. "Could be bodies that got loose from the cemetery." But we both knew that wasn't it. Bodies don't stand. Bodies don't walk. Bodies don't wave. As the motor roared back to life, I saw more shadows emerging from nearby houses, all moving with deliberate purpose through the floodwaters. Some walked along submerged streets, others tended to underwater gardens, a few even appeared to be having conversations, their mouths moving without sound. None of them seemed to realize they were underwater. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled me more, none of them realized they were dead. The boat accelerated away, but I couldn't tear my eyes from the water. In the reflection of the surface, for just a moment, I thought I saw my own face looking back at me from beneath the flood, pale, bloated, and smiling. I couldn't sleep that night. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Thompson's watery silhouette looking up at me from beneath the flood. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss what we'd seen, a trick of light, floating debris arranged in humanoid patterns, my own mind filling in familiar faces where there were none. But Pete had seen them too. At dawn, I called the emergency management office. "I need to go back out today," I told Frank Mercer, the coordinator. "There's a section we didn't finish mapping." "Take Marshall with you," Frank suggested. Pete called in sick. I wasn't surprised. Pete had been ashen-faced when we returned to dry land yesterday, refusing to discuss what we'd seen. He muttered something about needing a drink and disappeared. 2 hours later, I stood at the boat launch with Roger Marshall, a volunteer firefighter from 3 counties over who didn't know our town, didn't know our people. Maybe that was better. Maybe he wouldn't see what Pete and I had seen. "Beautiful morning," Marshall commented as we pushed off from the shore, the boat rocking gently. "Shame about the circumstances." I nodded, scanning the water's surface. It was calm today, reflecting the blue sky like a perfect mirror. Nothing seemed amiss. Perhaps yesterday had been a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. We'd all been working around the clock since the Cimarron River had breached its banks 8 days ago. "Head toward Pine Street," I instructed, pointing north. "We need to check the remaining residential blocks." As we approached the flooded neighborhood, I felt a subtle change in the atmosphere. The air grew cooler despite the climbing sun, and an unnatural silence fell around us. No birds called. Even the gentle splash of our boat seemed muted. "Does it feel strange to you?" I asked Marshall, keeping my voice low. He frowned, glancing around. "How do you mean?" Before I could answer, the water ahead of us rippled, though there was no wind. Beneath the surface, dark shapes began to form, not just 1 or 2 now, but dozens. People walking down submerged streets, children playing in underwater yards, neighbors chatting silently on drowned porches. Marshall saw them too. The boat lurched as he jerked in surprise. "What the hell?" he whispered, leaning over to stare into the depths. "I saw them yesterday," I admitted, my voice hollow. Pete and I both did. We drifted closer, the motor idling. Below us, an entire community went about its business, oblivious to the water filling their lungs, pressing down on their homes. I recognized the Millers, the Patels, old Dr. Wilson shuffling along with his cane, all residents who had evacuated. All alive and safe in shelters. Yet here they were, underwater versions continuing their routines as if nothing had changed. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to call out to them, to wake them from whatever dream they were living in. My hand moved to the edge of the boat, fingers trailing in the cool water. Marshall grabbed my wrist. "Don't," he said sharply. A child beneath us, Little Emma Parker from the house with the red shutters looked up, noticing our boat. She smiled, revealing rows of two sharp teeth, and began to rise toward us, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Go," I told Marshall, yanking my hand from the water. "Go now." He didn't argue, cranking the motor to full throttle. As we sped away, I looked back to see more figures rising toward the surface, their faces tilted upward, watching our retreat with hollow eyes. They couldn't have been real people," Marshall said once we were a safe distance away, his voice shaking. "Real people drown." "I don't think they're real," I agreed, wiping my wet hand obsessively against my pants. "Not anymore." The water where my fingers had touched felt unnaturally cold, the chills spreading slowly up my arm. When I examined my hand, the fingertips were pale, with a faint bluish tint. "Whatever they are," I continued, watching the color slowly return to my skin, "they know we're here now." As we completed our circuit of the flooded area, I noticed more and more figures gathering beneath us, following our path. Where before they had seemed oblivious to the water, now they appeared aware of our presence above them, reaching upward with grasping hands. "There's something else," Marshall said suddenly, pointing to a house I didn't recognize. "Look at the water level against that building." I looked where he indicated and felt my blood turn to ice. The water line on the wall was nearly 2 feet higher than the current flood level. "The water's going down," I whispered. Marshall nodded grimly. "What happens when there's not enough water left to keep them down there with us up here?" I had no answer, but as we turned back toward dry land, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figures below were smiling. That night, the rain came again. I stood on my porch watching the clouds gather, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. More rain meant higher water levels. Higher water meant the submerged figures would stay submerged. What was happening to me? I was hoping for more flooding, more destruction, when just days ago I'd been praying for clear skies. My phone buzzed. A text from Marshall. "Did you file the report about what we saw?" I hadn't. What would I even say? That drowned ghosts were walking beneath the floodwaters? That they reached for us with pale hands and 2 wide smiles? The emergency management team was already stretched thin, dealing with real problems, not hallucinations. "No," I texted back. Who would believe us? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then check the news. Channel 8. I flipped on the television to see Kristen Moore, a local reporter, standing at the edge of the flood zone, rain plastering her hair to her face despite the umbrella held by someone off camera. "Third sighting today," she was saying. Local volunteers report seeing what appear to be human figures moving beneath the floodwaters. Officials caution that these are likely debris or large fish disturbed by rescue boats. The camera panned to show the flooded area, now shrouded in evening gloom and falling rain. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface, a mass of shadows shifting in the murky depths. My phone rang. Marshall again. "You seen this?" he asked without preamble. "Yeah," I said, unable to look away from the screen. "We're not the only ones." "Jim," Marshall's voice dropped lower. "I went back out this afternoon. Took my phone, tried to get video. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. And nothing showed up on camera. Just murky water. But..." He hesitated. "One of them spoke to me." "That's impossible," I said automatically. "Sound doesn't..." Not out loud, he cut me off. In my head, a woman's voice. She asked if I was coming to join them. said there was room for everyone once the water receded. Lightning flashed outside my window, briefly illuminating the yard. For a split second, I thought I saw figures standing in the rain, watching my house. When darkness returned, it was gone. "Marshall, where are you now?" I asked, moving away from the window. "Home. 20 miles from the flood zone." He sounded exhausted. "But Jim, I can still hear her. Even here. Even now." I wanted to tell him he was just tired, that stress was making him imagine things. But the words died in my throat as I noticed water seeping under my front door, just a thin trickle, but steady. "The flood barriers are holding, right?" I asked, watching the puddle slowly spread across my entryway floor. "As far as I know," Marshall replied. "Why?" Another flash of lightning, and this time I was certain a figure stood in my yard, closer now. Water streamed from its clothes, its hair, its open mouth. "I have to go," I said, ending the call despite Marshall's protests. I approached the growing puddle cautiously. The water didn't seem to be coming from outside, it was simply appearing, spreading in an ever-widening circle. As I watched, it began to take shape, rising up from the floor like clay being molded by invisible hands. A head formed, then shoulders, then arms. The water figure straightened to its full height, dripping but somehow holding its humanoid shape. It had no distinct features, just smooth curves where a face should be. Then it spoke, not with sound but directly into my mind. "They miss you, Jim. They're waiting for you to come home." "Who?" I whispered, backing away until I hit the wall. "Everyone. The town. Your real family." The figure took a step toward me, leaving no wood footprints despite the water constantly streaming from its form. "You know you don't belong here, on the dry land. You're one of us now." It reached for me with a liquid hand. I scrambled sideways, knocking over a lamp in my panic. "Get out!" I shouted, though I knew sound meant nothing to this thing. "You're not real." The water figure paused, its featureless head tilting as if curious. Then, horribly, a seam split across what would be its face, widening into a gaping smile. "Look in the mirror, Jim. You've been with us since the first day of the flood." The thing collapsed, splashing across my floor and vanishing as if absorbed by the wood itself, leaving only a damp spot that was already beginning to dry. With trembling legs, I made my way to the bathroom, flipping on the harsh fluorescent light. My reflection stared back at me, pale and haggard, but solid, normal, human. Then I blinked, and for just an instant, I saw myself as I truly was, bloated, blue-lipped, with milky eyes and water streaming from my mouth. I stumbled back, crashing into the shower curtain and pulling it down as I fell. By the time I looked at the mirror again, my reflection was normal once more. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Like hundreds of feet walking on a submerged street. The water was rising. Soon, there would be nowhere left to hide. Dawn broke with unexpected sunshine, the storm having passed in the night. I hadn't slept, instead sitting in my living room with every light blazing, watching the spot where the water figure had formed and dissolved. My phone had been buzzing non-stop, texts from Marshall, calls from the emergency management team, even one from Pete, who'd apparently recovered from his illness. I ignored them all. Something was happening to me. The chill that had started in my fingertips yesterday had spread, a cold numbness creeping up my arms, across my chest. When I breathed, I felt a phantom pressure, as if my lungs were already filled with water. The flood was calling me home. No, not home. The flood is in your home. You're alive. But was I? I couldn't remember evacuating. Couldn't remember how I got into dry land when the waters rose. The more I tried to recall those first chaotic days, the hazier my memories became. My phone buzzed again. This time, I answered. Jim? Thank God. It was Frank from Emergency Management. We need you at the command center. The Army Corps of Engineers is saying the flood barriers could fail if the river rises another foot. I'll be right there, I said automatically. I dressed mechanically, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. Only as I reached for the handle did I notice my hands, pale blue, the skin puckered as if I'd been in a bath too long. It's just poor circulation, I told myself. Stress. Lack of sleep. But I pulled on gloves anyway before leaving the house. The command center was chaos when I arrived, a buzz of activity as officials coordinated evacuation efforts for outlying areas that might be affected if the barriers failed. Frank waved me over to a table covered with maps. The problem area is here, he said, pointing to a section of the flood wall. If it goes, we lose everything east of Willow Street. I stared at the map, trying to focus. The lines swam before my eyes, shifting like ripples on a pond. Water. Always water. Jim? You with me? I nodded, blinking hard. Yeah. Sorry. Didn't sleep well. Frank didn't look convinced but continued outlining the situation. I forced myself to pay attention, to be present, to ignore the sound of rushing water that seemed to fill my ears. Midway through the briefing, the door burst open. Marshall stumbled in, his clothes disheveled, eyes wild. They're coming out, he gasped, ignoring the startled looks from everyone in the room. The water's dropping and they're coming out. Frank stepped toward him, hands raised placatingly. Roger, you need to calm down. No! Marshall shouted, pointing at me. Tell them, Jim. Tell them what we saw. All eyes turned to me. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, only a trickle of water running down my chin. The room went silent. Someone gasped. I raised a gloved hand to my mouth, feeling the wetness there. Jim? Frank asked, his voice uncertain. Are you sick? I backed away from the table, from all those staring eyes. I need air, I managed to say, the words bubbling through the water in my throat. Outside, I gulped the warm morning air, trying to clear my lungs. But the pressure remained, that feeling of drowning on dry land. Marshall followed me out, grabbing my arm. It's happening to you too, isn't it? He demanded, pulling down the collar of his shirt to reveal gills, actual gills, forming along the side of his neck. I woke up like this. They're changing us, Jim. I shook him off, stumbling toward my truck. Stay away from me. We have to go back to the flood, Marshall called after me. That's what she told me. We have to return home. Home. The word echoed in my mind, in the voice of the water figure from last night. Come home, Jim. I drove without conscious thought, my body operating on autopilot while my mind spiraled into panic. I found myself at the edge of the flood zone, staring out at the expanse of water that had once been the heart of our town. The water level had indeed dropped, exposing the roofs of the tallest buildings. And there, I squinted, certain I was hallucinating. Figures were climbing out, pulling themselves onto the newly exposed surfaces. Dozens of them, water streaming from their clothes, their skin, their open mouths. My phone rang. "Pete, don't go near the water," he said without greeting, his voice frantic. "I saw them last night, coming out of Peterson Creek behind my place." They're not right, Jim." "I know," I whispered, watching as more figures emerged from the flood. Some I recognized, the Thompsons, the Millers, Dr. Wilson with his cane. All people who were supposedly safe in evacuation shelters. All people who were definitely alive. Unless they weren't. Unless none of us were. "Pete," I said slowly, an impossible thought forming. "When was the last time you actually saw someone who wasn't from Oak Ridge? Someone from outside?" Silence on the line. Then, I can't remember. A terrible suspicion gripped me. The flood never receded, did it? We never evacuated. We've been under the water all along. In the distance, I could see Marshall wading into the floodwaters, arms outstretched as if in welcome. The figures swarmed around him, pulling in deeper. Yet even as I watched this horror unfold, another part of me yearned to join them. To stop fighting the pressure in my lungs. To go home. My gloved hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather had split. Beneath the torn material, my skin was no longer skin at all, but something translucent, glistening. Something adapted for life underwater. "Pete," I said, my voice calm despite the terror coursing through me. "I think we died in the flood. All of us. The entire town." The realization should have broken me. Instead, it brought a strange peace. The pieces finally fit. Why we could see the underwater figures, but no one from outside could. Why they seemed so familiar yet so wrong. They weren't the ghosts. We were. As if confirming my thought, a massive shadow passed overhead, a rescue helicopter, its searchlight sweeping across the flood zone, passing right over me as if I weren't there at all. And I realized with perfect clarity, they couldn't see us because we were already beneath the surface. We had been all along. The rescue helicopter hovered above the flooded town, its spotlight cutting through the morning mist. I watched from my truck as a diver was lowered into the water, presumably searching for survivors or recovering the dead. They wouldn't find anyone. Not anyone from Oak Ridge. We were beyond their reach now. My phone had stopped working, the screen filled with water that hadn't been there minutes before. Pete's voice had gurgled away into static, then silence. I was alone with my impossible realization. I stepped out of the truck, my legs oddly buoyant, as if I might float away. The air felt thick, resistant, while the flooded area ahead called to me with the promise of weightlessness. Of belonging. More figures were emerging from the water now, dozens becoming hundreds. The residents of Oak Ridge, or what remained of them, gathering at the new shoreline. They didn't look quite human anymore. Their skin had the same translucent quality I noticed on my hands, their necks rippled with gill-like structures, their eyes were wide and unblinking. Yet I recognized every face. Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the bakery. Coach Diaz from the high school. Little Meg Fletcher, who delivered newspapers on her bike every morning. All dead. All changed. All waiting. As I approached, they parted to create a path for me. No one spoke, not with words, but I felt their collective consciousness brush against my mind, welcoming me, urging me forward. At the water's edge stood Marshall, transformed far beyond what I'd seen earlier. His clothes hung in tattered strips from a body that was more water than flesh, rippling and flowing yet somehow maintaining human shape. Only his eyes remained recognizable, watching me with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "You understand now," he said, his voice bypassing my ears to resonate directly in my mind. "We couldn't leave until everyone acknowledged the truth." "How did it happen?" I asked, though I already knew. The memories were returning now, washing over me like the flood itself. The warnings that came too late. The wall of water that swept through town in the middle of the night. The desperate scramble for higher ground that wasn't high enough. The realization in those final moments that none of us would survive. And then, this half-life. This denial. This community of the drowned, carrying on as if nothing had changed. We couldn't accept it, Marshall confirmed, his form rippling with each word. So we created this. A place between. But it was never sustainable. Behind him, the waters of the flood zone began to churn and rise, defying physics, defying reality itself. Because this wasn't reality, it was something else. A collective delusion maintained by 327 souls who refused to acknowledge their own deaths. "The water is receding in the real world," Marshall continued. "Soon there will be nothing left to hide beneath. We have to go deeper." "Deeper where?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. Marshall's mouth stretched into an impossibly wide smile. "Home, Jim. Our real home now." He extended a hand that was barely solid, fingers elongating like tendrils of water. I should have been terrified. Should have run screaming back to what I thought was my house, my life, my continued existence. Instead, I felt only relief, the relief of finally understanding, of no longer having to pretend. I reached out, my own hand now as transparent as his. Our fingers merged, the boundary between us dissolving. "What about the outside world?" I asked, my last tie to human concerns. "Will they know what happened to us?" Marshall's form surged and receded like a tide. They'd known for days. They'd been recovering our bodies all along. The helicopter above dipped lower, the diver surfacing with something in tow. I looked up and experienced the strangest sensation, seeing my own corpse being lifted from the water, bloated and gray, yet somehow less real than the transparent form I now inhabited. Around me, the other residents of Oak Ridge were changing, their humanoid shapes melting, flowing, becoming one with the flood. Some retained vague human features, a face here, a hand there, while others surrendered completely to their new nature, becoming nothing but conscious currents in the greater whole. The truth didn't horrify me anymore. We hadn't survived the flood, we had become it. I turned to Marshall one last time, but he was barely recognizable now, just a human-shaped ripple in the water. "Is this the end?" I asked. His laugh bubbled through my consciousness. "No, Jim. It's just a change of state." With that, he collapsed into the flood, his consciousness merging with the others, becoming part of something greater. Something eternal. Something that would flow and ebb and rise again with the next rainfall. I looked down at my increasingly translucent body, then back at the helicopter, retrieving what I once was. The barrier between worlds, between life and death, between past and future, was as thin and fragile as the surface of water. I took a step forward, then another, wading into the flood that was now my people, my family, myself. The water embraced me, cool and welcoming. There was no struggle, no drowning, just acceptance. As my consciousness began to disperse, joining with the others in the collective flow, I had one final human thought. The next time the waters rise and people look down from their boats into the flood, they'll see shadows moving beneath the surface. They'll see figures walking underwater as if it were air. And they'll never know if what they're seeing is debris, or fish, or a trick of the light. Or if they're looking at their own futures, reflected back at them from beneath the flood. 3 months later, a family moved into a newly renovated house in Oak Ridge, Oklahoma. The previous owners had been lost in the flood that devastated the town earlier that year. All traces of water damage had been repaired, all memories of tragedy painted over. On their first night, the youngest child complained about the sound of dripping coming from her closet, but all the pipes were new and the weather was dry. Her parents dismissed it as imagination, the natural anxiety of moving to a new place with a troubled history. But that night, as the family slept, water began to seep from beneath doors, from between floorboards, from the very walls themselves, not enough to damage, just enough to remind. Just enough to whisper, we're still here, beneath the surface. And there's room for everyone when the waters rise again. Have you ever felt that inanimate objects might be watching you? That the walls of an old house might whisper secrets if only you knew how to listen? I never believed such nonsense until I inherited Oak Ridge Manor. The ancient Virginia estate stood proudly atop a gentle hill, surrounded by century-old oaks whose branches scratched against the windows on windy nights like skeletal fingers seeking entrance. The house had been in my family for generations, though I had visited only twice as a child. Now, following the unexpected death of my great-aunt Eleanor, it belonged to me. The drive from Richmond took nearly 2 hours, and I arrived as the sun began its descent behind the trees. The fading light cast long shadows across the lawn, transforming the pastoral scene into something more sinister. The house itself, a stately federal-style mansion with imposing white columns, seemed to loom larger than I remembered. Thomas Blackwell, the estate attorney, met me at the entrance with a ring of ancient keys. Miss Catherine, he greeted me, his expression somber. My condolences for your loss. Your great-aunt spoke of you often. Thank you, I replied, though I barely remembered Eleanor. My childhood visits had been brief and unmemorable, save for one peculiar detail I couldn't quite place. The massive oak door creaked open to reveal a grand foyer. Dust particles danced in the fading sunlight that streamed through tall windows. The air smelled of beeswax and something else, something old and forgotten. The house has been maintained, but I'm afraid it's been some time since anyone lived here full-time, Thomas explained, leading me inside. Your great-aunt moved to the guest house on the property about 15 years ago. Said the main house had become unwelcoming. I raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Eleanor had always been eccentric according to family lore. The utilities are connected, and I've had the place cleaned, he continued. Your great-aunt was quite specific that you should stay in the main house, at least initially. That's odd, I murmured, trailing my fingers along a mahogany side table. Despite the cleaning, a thin film of dust coated my fingertips. Indeed, Eleanor had her peculiarities. Thomas glanced at his watch. I must be going. The keys are labeled, and I've left my card on the kitchen counter should you need anything. After Thomas departed, I stood alone in the foyer, listening to the settling sounds of the old house. The ticking of a grandfather clock echoed from somewhere deep within. A floorboard creaked overhead, though I was certain no one else was present. And then I remembered. The chandelier. My gaze drifted upward to the magnificent crystal chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling. It was exactly as I remembered from childhood, an elaborate construction of cut crystal and silver, its facets catching and fracturing the fading light. Hundreds of crystal teardrops dangled from curved arms, creating a constellation of tiny rainbows across the walls. Something about that chandelier had fascinated and disturbed me as a child. I recalled standing beneath it, mesmerized by its sparkling beauty, until my mother had urgently pulled me away, muttering something about not standing there after dark. Now, as an adult, I found myself once again captivated by its splendor. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly European, probably dating back to the early 1800s. It must have been worth a fortune. As I watched, the final rays of sunlight struck the chandelier at an odd angle. For just a moment, so briefly I might have imagined it, the crystals seemed to shift and rearrange. Within their depths, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something impossible, figures in antiquated clothing, dancing in what appeared to be this very foyer, though furnished differently. I blinked, and the vision vanished. Clearly, fatigue from the long drive was affecting me. After retrieving my luggage from the car, I explored the ground floor. The kitchen had been modernized sometime in the 1980s, while the dining room remained frozen in the 19th century, complete with a massive table that could seat 20. The library contained floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines cracked when opened. As darkness fell completely, I returned to the foyer to turn on lights. My hand hesitated over the switch that would illuminate the chandelier. Some childish instinct warned against it, but I dismissed the feeling as foolish and flipped the switch. The chandelier blazed to life, its crystals casting fractured light across the walls. For a second, I could have sworn I heard music, faint strains of a waltz played on distant instruments. I shook my head, blaming my imagination. That night, I chose a bedroom on the second floor, the master suite at the end of the long hallway. The four-poster bed dominated the room, draped with heavy burgundy curtains that matched the window treatments. After unpacking, I prepared for bed, exhausted from the day's journey. Sleep came quickly, but didn't last. I awoke suddenly in the middle of the night, unsure what had disturbed me. The house was silent except for the persistent ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of settling timber. Then I heard it, the delicate tinkling of crystal, as if a slight breeze had disturbed the chandelier downstairs. But there was no breeze, the windows were closed against the autumn chill. I slipped from bed and grabbed my robe, telling myself I should check if a window had been left open elsewhere. The hallway was dark save for a faint glow emanating from the staircase. I hadn't left any lights on downstairs. As I approached the top of the stairs, the tinkling sound grew louder, accompanied now by what sounded like muffled voices and music. The same distant waltz I thought I'd imagined earlier. My rational mind suggested intruders, but something deeper whispered otherwise. I descended the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the polished banister. The foyer below was transformed. The chandelier glowed with an impossible brightness, though I knew I'd turned it off before bed. Its light seemed different, warmer, like candlelight rather than electricity. The crystals spun slowly, casting moving shadows across the walls. And within those shadows, I saw them, ghostly figures in period dress, dancing to music I could barely hear. Ladies in empire waist gowns and gentlemen in tailcoats moved through the foyer in elegant patterns. Their faces were indistinct, but their movements were graceful, deliberate. I froze on the stairs, my knuckles white on the banister. I wanted to flee back to my bedroom, to hide under the covers like a frightened child, but I couldn't move. The scene below held me transfixed. One of the dancing figures, a woman in a blue gown, looked up toward the stairs. Though I couldn't make out her features clearly, I knew with absolute certainty that she was looking directly at me. She raised her hand, as if in greeting or warning. At that moment, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2, breaking the spell. I blinked, and the visions vanished. The chandelier hung dark and still, the foyer empty and silent. I retreated to my bedroom, heart pounding. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Stress, fatigue, and overactive imagination, all plausible explanations. Yet none quite explained the intensity of the experience. As dawn's first light filtered through the curtains, I made a decision. I would learn everything I could about Oak Ridge Manor, its history, and especially that chandelier. If I was to live here, I needed to understand what forces were at work within these walls. Little did I know that the chandelier had only begun to reveal its secrets, and that what I had witnessed was merely a gentle introduction to the horrors that awaited me. Morning brought clarity and doubt in equal measure. Had I truly witnessed spectral dancers beneath the chandelier, or had exhaustion conjured an elaborate hallucination? The rational part of my mind insisted on the latter, yet something deeper, something primal, knew what I had seen was real. After a restless night, I dressed quickly and ventured downstairs, pausing at the bottom of the staircase to study the chandelier in daylight. It hung innocently, crystal still and unmoving, catching occasional sunbeams that filtered through the tall windows. Nothing about it suggested the uncanny display of the previous night. I prepared coffee in the outdated kitchen and carried my laptop to the library. The room smelled of old paper and leather, a scent both comforting and antiquated. Settling into a wingback chair by the window, I began researching Oak Ridge Manor's history. The house, I discovered, had been built in 1824 by my ancestor, Jonathan Hargrove, a wealthy tobacco merchant. The property had remained in the family since, passing from generation to generation. What caught my attention, however, was a brief mention of the chandelier imported from France as a gift for Jonathan's wife, Elizabeth. Further digging revealed that Oak Ridge had once been known for its lavish balls and gatherings. The elite of Virginia's society had danced beneath that very chandelier during the antebellum period. But there was a darker note as well. In 1863, Elizabeth Hargrove had been found dead at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken. Rumors of foul play had circulated, with suspicion falling on her husband, though nothing was ever proven. As I read this, a chill ran down my spine. Was this connected to what I had seen? Were the dancers shadows of those long-ago balls? And had Elizabeth been the woman in the blue gown who had seemed to warn me? A knock at the door interrupted my research. Through the peephole, I saw an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, clutching a covered dish. "Hello there," she greeted warmly when I opened the door. "Margaret Fleming. I was your great-aunt's neighbor. I live just down the road. Thought I'd bring you some welcome banana bread and introduce myself." I invited her in, grateful for the distraction from my unsettling discoveries. Margaret's eyes immediately drifted upward to the chandelier as we entered the foyer. "Still beautiful as ever," she murmured, then seemed to catch herself. "Eleanor mentioned you'd be coming to stay. How are you finding the old place?" We settled in the parlor with tea and her banana bread. Margaret proved to be a wealth of information about the area, and eventually, I steered the conversation toward the house itself. "You know," she said, her voice lowering conspiratorially, "Eleanor refused to sleep in this house for the last decade and a half of her life. Said she couldn't bear what she saw in that chandelier after dark." My cup clattered against its saucer. What exactly did she see? Margaret studied me intently. "You've seen something already, haven't you? The past playing out like some kind of phantom theater?" I nodded slowly, relieved that someone else knew about the phenomenon. "It started happening about 70 years ago, according to local lore," Margaret explained. The chandelier shows scenes from the house's history, some beautiful, some less so. She hesitated. Eleanor said the visions grew worse over time. More violent. More disturbing. Do you know why? Or how it happens? There are theories. Margaret set down her teacup. Some say the crystals somehow absorbed memories from the light they reflected. Others think someone enchanted it deliberately. Your great-aunt believed that Elizabeth Hargrove's violent death somehow charged it with energy, allowing it to capture moments of high emotion that occurred beneath it. I shivered despite the warmth of the room. What should I do? Eleanor wanted you to stay here for a reason, Margaret said cryptically. Perhaps there's something she thought you needed to see. But be careful, Catherine. Don't become obsessed like she did. And whatever you do, don't stand directly beneath it when it's active. After Margaret left, I returned to the library, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave immediately, but curiosity and a strange sense of obligation kept me rooted. If Aunt Eleanor had wanted me here, she must have had a purpose. As afternoon faded to evening, I found myself drawn to the foyer again. The chandelier caught the last rays of sunlight, sending rainbow prisms dancing across the walls. Beautiful, yet somehow ominous. I spent the evening exploring the house more thoroughly, discovering a door to the attic hidden at the end of the third-floor hallway. The space was dusty and cluttered with trunks and furniture draped in yellowed sheets. A quick search revealed nothing of immediate interest, though I made a mental note to return in daylight for a more thorough investigation. Night fell, and with it came a growing sense of apprehension. Would the chandelier perform again? Part of me hoped it wouldn't, while another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries, hoped it would. I tried to distract myself with a book in the library, but my attention kept drifting to the sounds of the house. Every creak and settle seemed amplified in the darkness. The ticking of the grandfather clock marked the relentless passage of time. At precisely 11:15, I heard it, the delicate tinkling of crystal. My heart raced as I set down my book and moved cautiously toward the foyer. The chandelier glowed with that same otherworldly light I'd seen before, but this time the scene it projected was different. No dancers filled the space below. Instead, I saw two figures, a man and a woman, engaged in a heated argument. Their voices reached me as if from underwater, distorted and unclear, but their body language conveyed their fury. The woman, Elizabeth, I presumed, wore the same blue gown I'd noticed the night before. The man towered over her, his face contorted with rage. As I watched, frozen on the threshold, he grabbed her shoulders and shook her violently. I wanted to intervene, to shout a warning, but these were merely shadows of events long past. There was nothing I could do but witness. The argument intensified. The man, Jonathan Hargrove, I assumed, pointed toward the stairs, his gesture commanding. Elizabeth refused, shaking her head vehemently. He raised his hand as if to strike her, and I gasped involuntarily. At the sound, both figures turned toward me. Unlike the previous night, when the faces had been indistinct, I could now see their features clearly. Elizabeth's eyes widened in recognition, though that was impossible. Jonathan's face transformed from anger to alarm. Elizabeth's lips moved, forming words I strained to hear. He knows you're watching. Cold dread washed over me. This was no mere replay of past events. Somehow, impossibly, these apparitions were aware of my presence. Jonathan took a step in my direction, his expression now one of calculated menace. I retreated instinctively, bumping into a side table and knocking a vase to the floor. The crash shattered both the porcelain and the vision. The chandelier went dark, the figures vanished, and I was alone in the foyer with my hammering heart and the pieces of broken vase at my feet. My hands trembled as I cleaned up the mess. What had I just witnessed? Not merely a past argument, but something interactive, reactive. The implications terrified me. If these weren't simple recordings of past events, but something more conscious, what else might they be capable of? Sleep eluded me once again that night. I lay awake in the master bedroom, listening to the house's nocturnal symphony, the wind in the eaves, the tick of clocks, the occasional shift and groan of old timber. But beneath those familiar sounds, I detected something else, something that might have been the distant murmur of voices or the soft footfall of someone pacing the hallway outside my door. When I finally did drift off near dawn, my dreams were filled with fragmented images, Elizabeth's frightened eyes, Jonathan's threatening stance, and always the chandelier watching over everything like a crystalline spider at the center of its web. I awoke with a start to brilliant morning sunshine and a single, disturbing realization: I needed to learn exactly what had happened to Elizabeth Hargrove in 1863. Not just a public account, but the truth, whatever that might be. And somewhere in this house, I was certain, lay the answers. Whether in dusty journals, hidden correspondence, or within the chandelier's terrible visions, the truth waited to be discovered. What I couldn't yet know was the price I might have to pay for that knowledge. The local historical society occupied a quaint Victorian building in the nearby town of Millfield. Miss Abigail Pendleton, the elderly archivist, peered at me over wire-rimmed spectacles as I explained my interest in Oak Ridge Manor and the Hargrove family. "Researching your own family history?" she asked, leading me through narrow aisles lined with document boxes and leather-bound volumes. "Yes," I replied. "Particularly anything related to Elizabeth Hargrove's death in 1863. Miss Pendleton's steps faltered. "Oh, that unfortunate business." She gave me a measured look. "You're staying at the manor, then?" When I nodded, her expression grew troubled. "That house has a reputation, you know. Not just for Elizabeth's death. There have been other incidents over the years." She led me to a small research room and disappeared into the archives, returning minutes later with several boxes. These contained newspapers, personal correspondence, and county records from that period. "There's also a diary that might interest you. It belonged to Josephine Mortimer, Elizabeth's closest friend." I spent hours poring over the materials. The newspaper accounts confirmed what I already knew. Elizabeth had been found dead at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken. The inquest ruled it an accident, concluding she had tripped and fallen in the dark. Josephine Mortimer's diary told a different story. In careful, slanted handwriting, she documented her suspicions. April 15, 1863, visited with Elizabeth today. She seems increasingly fearful of Jonathan. Claims he has changed drastically in recent months, flying into rages over trivial matters. When I suggested she confide in her brother, she became agitated, saying Jay had threatened harm should she speak to anyone about their private affairs. I am deeply concerned. May 2nd, 1863, Elizabeth showed me a bruise on her arm today, claiming she had bumped into a doorframe. I did not believe her. The mark was clearly in the shape of fingers. She begged me not to interfere, saying it would only make matters worse. What is happening in that house? The final entry, dated 2 days before Elizabeth's death, sent chills down my spine. June 18, 1863, E. sent a note requesting I come urgently tomorrow evening. Says she has discovered something terrible about Jay and fears for her life. Says it involves the chandelier he gifted her and what it shows at night. I pray she is merely suffering from nervous excitement, but I will go to her without delay. Josephine never made that visit. Elizabeth died the following night, before her friend could respond to the summons. What had Elizabeth discovered? What secret involving the chandelier had been worth killing for? I returned to Oakridge Manor as afternoon shadows lengthened across the lawn. The house seemed to watch my approach, its windows reflecting the dying sunlight like knowing eyes. Inside, the foyer felt colder than the rest of the house, despite the summer heat outside. My gaze was drawn upward to the chandelier. In daylight, it appeared nothing more than an exquisite antique, its crystals gleaming innocently. I recalled Margaret's warning not to stand directly beneath it when active. What had happened to those who ignored such advice? I wasn't certain I wanted to know. With renewed purpose, I headed to the attic. This time, armed with a powerful flashlight, I conducted a methodical search of the space. Most trunks contained typical family detritus, outdated clothing, holiday decorations, children's toys from various eras. But in a far corner, beneath a sloped section of roof too low to stand under comfortably, I discovered a small, iron-bound chest. Unlike the other storage containers, this one was locked. The keyhole was unusual, tiny and oddly shaped. None of the keys Thomas had given me seemed likely to fit it. I carried the chest downstairs to the library where the light was better. Turning it over in my hands, I noticed something engraved on the bottom, the initials EH and a small symbol that resembled a teardrop or perhaps a crystal. Elizabeth Hargrove's chest. My heart raced with anticipation. But how to open it without damaging the contents? As I contemplated this problem, my eyes were drawn to a small decorative box on one of the bookshelves. I'd noticed it during my previous research session, but paid it little attention. Now, something about its design called to me. It was inlaid with mother of pearl in a pattern that echoed the shape of the chandelier. Inside the box, nestled on faded velvet, lay an ornate silver key with an unusual shaft, exactly the right size and shape for the chest's lock. My hands trembled slightly as I fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside the chest, I found several items: a leather-bound journal, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a daguerreotype in a silver frame, and a small velvet pouch. The daguerreotype showed a handsome couple, Jonathan and Elizabeth Hargrove, presumably. She was beautiful, with large, expressive eyes and dark hair arranged in elaborate curls. He was distinguished looking with a severe expression that seemed at odds with the occasion of a portrait sitting. I opened the journal first. The handwriting matched that on the letters I'd examined at the Historical Society, Elizabeth's own account of her life at Oakridge. I began reading, occasionally glancing nervously at the windows as daylight gradually faded. The early entries described her happiness as a new bride, her delight in the magnificent house, and her excitement when Jonathan presented her with the chandelier, a masterpiece of French craftsmanship imported at great expense. As the years progressed, the tone changed. Jonathan's business pressures mounted. He became moody, then volatile. Elizabeth wrote of arguments and growing fear, confirming Josephine's observations. Then came entries that made my blood run cold. March 10th, 1863, it happened again last night. I awoke to find the chandelier alight, though no candles burned within it. Below, shadows moved, scenes I recognized from weeks past. I watched myself and Jay, at dinner, saw again our argument about the Henderson property. How is this possible? Am I losing my mind? April 23rd, 1863, the chandelier shows more each night. No longer just recent events, but scenes from years past. Last evening, I witnessed my own wedding day. Jay says I imagine things, that I am becoming hysterical. But Marie, the maid, has seen it too, though she crosses herself and refuses to speak of it. The entries continued, describing increasingly disturbing visions in the chandelier. Then, a revelation. June 16th, 1863, God help me. Tonight I saw what truly happened to poor Mr. Abernathy. Not an accident on the hunt as Jay claimed. The chandelier showed Jay arguing with him at the edge of the North Woods, then striking him down in rage. Jay has killed a man. What am I to do with this knowledge? To whom can I turn? June 17th, 1863, Jay knows I have seen. I don't know how, but he knows. He watched me strangely at breakfast, asked if I had been wandering the house at night again. When I denied it, his eyes grew cold. He knows. I have written to Josephine. Pray she comes quickly. I must leave this place. That was the final entry. Elizabeth had died the very next night. My hands shook as I set down the journal. Outside, darkness had fallen completely. The house was silent save for the ticking of clocks and my own shallow breathing. With a sudden sense of urgency, I turned to the velvet pouch. Inside was a crystal, a single teardrop-shaped pendant that looked as if it had been removed from the chandelier. Attached was a small note in Elizabeth's handwriting, the keystone. Without it, the visions cannot form completely. Keep it separate if danger threatens. I clutched the crystal, understanding dawning. Elizabeth had removed this piece from the chandelier, perhaps as insurance or as a way to control its power. And after her death, someone had hidden it away with her personal belongings. A soft tinkling sound from the foyer interrupted my thoughts. The chandelier was awakening. Gripping the crystal pendant in one hand and my flashlight in the other, I moved cautiously toward the foyer. The chandelier glowed with that now familiar ethereal light, but the illumination seemed uneven, fractured. The visions it projected were similarly broken, fragments of scenes that shifted and changed like pieces of a shattered mirror being reassembled. In one fragment, I saw Elizabeth pleading with Jonathan. In another, she stood beneath the chandelier, reaching up toward it. In a third, most disturbing of all, Jonathan dragged something heavy across the foyer floor, something wrapped in what appeared to be a carpet. The fragments shifted faster, becoming more coherent as if the chandelier was gathering strength, focusing its energy. And then, with sudden clarity, I saw the complete scene, Elizabeth at the top of the stairs, backing away from Jonathan's advancing figure, his hands outstretched, her terrified expression, the fatal push, her tumbling body, the sickening impact at the bottom of the staircase. Murder. Not an accident. The truth Elizabeth had discovered about her husband had led to her own death. As I watched, frozen in horror, the scene reset itself. But this time, Jonathan turned away from Elizabeth's broken body and looked directly at me. His eyes were no longer those of a man from a century and a half ago. They were aware, present, malevolent. His lips moved, forming words I could somehow hear in my mind. You shouldn't have come back, Elizabeth. A chill of pure terror ran through me. He thought I was Elizabeth, or rather, her spirit returned. The resemblance between us, noticeable in the daguerreotype, must be stronger than I realized. Jonathan's apparition took a step toward me. Then another. The distance between us seemed to compress, the laws of physics bending as this spectral figure moved from the realm of visions into my reality. The crystal in my hand grew hot, vibrating with energy. Instinctively, I raised it toward the chandelier. Stay back, I commanded, my voice cracking with fear. Jonathan's face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, hands outstretched toward my throat. I screamed, stumbling backward, and collided with a small table. As I fell, the crystal flew from my grasp, arcing through the air toward the chandelier above. Time seemed to slow as the teardrop pendant met its parent structure. There was a blinding flash of light, a sound like 1,000 glass windows shattering simultaneously, and then darkness. I lay on the floor, stunned, my ears ringing. When my vision cleared, I saw that the chandelier hung intact overhead, but now completely dark and still. Of Jonathan's threatening apparition, there was no sign. Had the crystal somehow neutralized the chandelier's power? Or had reuniting the missing piece completed some cycle, laying to rest the restless energies trapped within? I dragged myself to my feet, muscles trembling with residual fear and adrenaline. Whatever had happened, one thing was certain: I could not spend another night in this house until I understood more. As I turned to flee to my bedroom to pack an overnight bag, planning to find a hotel in town, a new sound reached my ears, the front door opening. Footsteps in the entryway. A familiar voice calling my name. Thomas Blackwell, the estate attorney, stood framed in the doorway. His expression, visible in the light from the porch, was grim. "Catherine," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. "I thought I might find you researching tonight. You always were too curious for your own good, just like your aunt. Just like Elizabeth." A cold dread settled in my stomach as he stepped into the darkened foyer. In his hand was something that caught the faint light from outside, something that gleamed dully. A knife. "Did you really think we'd let you discover the truth? Our family has protected this secret for generations." Our family? My mind raced to understand. Then it clicked: Blackwell. An anglicized version of Moore, which had been Jonathan's mother's maiden name. Thomas was a descendant of Jonathan Hargrove, not through Elizabeth, but through some other line. "The chandelier shows the truth," I said, backing away slowly. "Jonathan murdered Elizabeth. And Mr. Abernathy before her." Thomas smiled thinly. "The chandelier shows many things. Not all of them true, not all of them false. A mixture designed to confuse. To protect." "Protect what?" "The legacy. The fortune. Built on blood, yes, but what great fortune isn't?" He advanced another step. "Your aunt nearly exposed everything. We couldn't allow that. Just as we can't allow you to continue." My back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to retreat. Above us, the chandelier remained dark and silent, offering neither illumination nor escape. As Thomas raised the knife, a single crystal from the chandelier, perhaps loosened in the earlier commotion, detached and fell. It struck him on the temple, drawing blood and momentarily distracting him. In that instant, I dove past him toward the open front door and the safety of the night beyond. The night air hit my lungs like ice water as I fled across the lawn. Behind me, Thomas's enraged shout echoed from the doorway. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. My only thought was to reach my car, parked in the circular driveway. Fumbling with the keys, I finally wrenched the driver's door open and threw myself inside, locking it just as Thomas emerged from the house. His silhouette paused at the top of the porch steps, outlined against the light from the foyer. Even from this distance, I could feel his calculating gaze assessing the situation. With shaking hands, I started the engine and reversed out of the driveway, gravel spraying. Only when Oak Ridge Manor had disappeared from my rearview mirror did I allow myself to breathe normally. Where'd it go? Not a hotel, too exposed, too easily found. Margaret Fleming, I decided. My great-aunt's neighbor and apparent confidant might provide both sanctuary and answers. Margaret's cottage lay about 2 miles down the winding country road. Lights still burned in her windows despite the late hour. I parked haphazardly and rushed to her door, pounding urgently. When she opened it, her eyes widened at my disheveled appearance. "Catherine, good heavens, what's happened to you?" Words tumbled out in a chaotic flood: the chandelier, the visions, Elizabeth's journal, Thomas's attack. Margaret ushered me inside and bolted the door, then guided me to her kitchen where she poured 2 generous glasses of brandy. "Drink," she instructed. "Then we'll talk." The brandy burned my throat but steadied my nerves. As my breathing normalized, Margaret studied me with an expression of grim resignation. "I feared this might happen," she said finally. "Eleanor warned me before she died that if anything happened to her, you might come seeking answers. She made me promise to help you if you did." "Help me how?" I asked. "And what happened to my aunt?" Thomas implied she didn't die naturally. Margaret sighed heavily. "Your aunt was getting too close to the truth. About this chandelier, about Elizabeth's murder, about everything. She'd been researching for years, ever since she first witnessed the visions. And she was killed for it. It looked like natural causes, a stroke. But Eleanor had been warning me for weeks that she was being watched, that strange things were happening in the house." Margaret's hands tightened around her glass. I didn't take her seriously enough. I thought age and isolation had made her paranoid. By the time I realized she might be right, it was too late. "And now Thomas is trying to silence me too," I said, the reality of my situation finally sinking in. "Thomas is just the most recent guardian of the secret," Margaret explained. "The Hargroves, or the Blackwells, as that branch of the family became known, have been protecting it for generations. Too much depends on it. What secret could possibly be worth killing for after all this time?" Margaret rose and went to a bookshelf, returning with a worn leather folder. "Your aunt entrusted this to me before she died. She said I would know when it was time to share it. Inside were photocopies of ancient documents, land deeds, banking records, and what appeared to be coded correspondence. Jonathan Hargrove's fortune wasn't built on tobacco alone," Margaret explained. "During the War of 1812, he worked as a privateer, essentially a legal pirate with government sanction to raid British ships. But Jonathan continued his activities long after the war ended, when such actions were no longer sanctioned." "He was a criminal," I said, pieces beginning to fall into place. "A very successful one. The Hargrove fortune, which still finances the Blackwell family today, was built on stolen gold, gems, and goods. Elizabeth discovered this, along with evidence of multiple murders Jonathan committed to protect his secret, including Mr. Abernathy. Yes, he was a former crew member who threatened exposure." Margaret's expression darkened. But Elizabeth's discovery was even more dangerous. She found proof that Jonathan had murdered his own brother to claim the family business as his own. With that evidence, she could have destroyed everything. "And the chandelier?" I asked, fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "How does it fit into all this?" "That's where the story takes a stranger turn," Margaret said, lowering her voice although we were alone in the house. "The chandelier wasn't just an expensive gift. It came from a French vessel Jonathan raided, a ship carrying items looted from an Egyptian tomb. The crystals were said to have unusual properties. Properties that allow it to capture and replay past events." Margaret nodded. According to Eleanor's research, the ancient Egyptians believed certain crystals could store memories, impressions of events that occurred in their presence. Jonathan didn't know what he possessed when he installed it in his home, but over time, the chandelier began to reveal its power. By showing Elizabeth what her husband had done, I murmured, "Exactly." And afterward, it continued its silent witness, recording Jonathan's murder of Elizabeth and every subsequent crime and cover-up by the family. I shuddered, remembering the fractured visions I'd seen. But why me? Why did my aunt want me to inherit the house? Because of who you are, Catherine. You're not just any Hargrove descendant. You're from Elizabeth's side of the family, her niece's line. You bear her blood, her features, and according to Eleanor, you might share her sensitivity to the chandelier's power. The revelation stunned me. I'd always known I was adopted, raised by loving parents with no connection to the Hargroves. To discover I was actually blood related to this family, to Elizabeth herself, shifted my understanding of everything. Eleanor believed the chandelier would respond to you, Margaret continued. That you might be able to control it in ways others couldn't. She hoped you would finish what she started, exposing the truth and ending the Blackwell family's blood-soaked legacy. But how? I barely escaped with my life tonight. Thomas will be looking for me. Not just Thomas, Margaret said grimly. The family has connections throughout the county, police, judges, business leaders. They've spent generations building their influence. She rose and went to a sideboard, returning with an old-fashioned key. This is why Eleanor arranged for you to stay in the main house. There's a hidden room beneath the library, a secret vault where Jonathan kept his most incriminating records. Eleanor discovered its existence but could never find the entrance. She believed you might succeed where she failed. I stared at the key. And this opens it? Eleanor thought so. She found it concealed in the frame of Elizabeth's portrait, the one hanging in the upstairs hallway. My mind raced with implications. If there's evidence in that vault that could expose the family's crimes, it would bring down the entire Blackwell empire, Margaret finished. But getting back into that house won't be easy. Thomas will be watching. I have to try, I said, newfound determination steadying my voice. For Elizabeth. For my aunt. For all their victims. Margaret studied me thoughtfully. There might be a way. Thomas doesn't know you've spoken to me. He'll assume you fled town or gone to the police. If you return before dawn, you might catch him off guard. Return? You want me to go back tonight? It's your best chance. The chandelier's power is strongest at night. If Eleanor was right about your connection to it, you might be able to use that power rather than fear it. The very thought made my skin crawl, but Margaret's reasoning was sound. Thomas would expect me to run, not return. And if I waited until morning, he would have time to search the house, perhaps find the vault himself. There's something else you should know, Margaret added, her expression grave. The crystal you found, the one that reacted when you approached the chandelier, it's not just a piece of the fixture. According to Eleanor's research, it's a key component, what the Egyptians called the Eye of Memory. Without it, the chandelier can only show fragments of the past. But when I dropped it, it seemed to fly toward the chandelier by itself. The pieces want to be whole, Margaret said simply. But that completeness comes at a price. A fully empowered chandelier doesn't just show the past, it can potentially influence the present. What does that mean? Eleanor believed that Jonathan's spirit, or some echo of his consciousness, became bound to the chandelier when he died in that house in 1872. That's why the visions seem aware, why they can interact with observers. If the chandelier regains its full power, his influence could grow stronger, I finished, a chill running down my spine. Margaret nodded grimly. Which is why you'll need this. She handed me a small cloth bag. Inside was a crude tool that looked like a glass cutter. If things go wrong, destroy the chandelier. Break the crystals, especially the centerpiece where I reconnected. It may be the only way to end this. We spent the next hour planning my return to Oak Ridge Manor. Margaret provided me with a flashlight, the glass cutter, and a small can of pepper spray for protection against more corporeal threats. I changed into dark clothing she loaned me and tied my hair back tightly. As I prepared to leave, Margaret gripped my shoulders. Be careful, Catherine. Remember, the chandelier shows truth, but not always completely. Trust what you see, but question how it's presented. I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. If I don't come back, I'll go to the state police, she promised. I have copies of everything Eleanor discovered. It won't be enough to bring down the Blackwells, but it might start an investigation. The drive back to Oak Ridge Manor was tense, every shadow on the road seeming to hold potential danger. I parked half a mile away and approached on foot, staying within the tree line that bordered the property. The house loomed against the night sky, most windows dark. Thomas's car was gone from the driveway, but that didn't mean he wasn't inside, waiting. Or perhaps he'd gone to alert other family members about the threat I posed. I circled to the rear of the property, recalling a servant's entrance that led to the kitchen. The door was locked, but an adjacent window had a broken latch, something I noticed days earlier and meant to fix. Now, that oversight provided my way in. The kitchen was dark and silent. I moved through it cautiously, ears straining for any sound that might indicate another presence in the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, each resonant note making me flinch. I needed to reach the library, find the secret vault, and retrieve whatever evidence it contained, all without alerting Thomas if he returned. And I needed to be wary of the chandelier, which now contained the eye of memory and might be more powerful than ever. As I approached the foyer, I saw that the chandelier hung dark and still. No ghostly illumination, no phantom visions. Was it dormant or waiting? I skirted the edges of the foyer, careful not to walk directly beneath the crystal fixture. In the library, I closed the door behind me and used my flashlight to examine the room more thoroughly than I had before. What had Eleanor discovered that made her believe there was a hidden vault? I ran my hands along the wood paneling, feeling for inconsistencies. Checked beneath the carpet for signs of a trapdoor. Examined the bookshelves for hollow spaces or mechanical triggers. Nothing. Frustration mounted as minutes ticked by. Every moment increased the risk of Thomas returning. I sat in the wingback chair, trying to think like my great-aunt, trying to imagine what clues she might have found. My gaze fell on the small decorative box where I discovered the key to Elizabeth's chest. The mother-of-pearl inlay formed a pattern that resembled the chandelier. I'd noted the similarity before, but hadn't considered its significance. With renewed interest, I examined the box more closely. The pattern wasn't just similar to the chandelier, it was an exact replica in miniature. And at the center, where the eye crystal would be positioned, was a tiny keyhole. My hands trembled as I inserted the key Margaret had given me. It fit perfectly. When I turned it, the entire top of the box lifted to reveal not a storage compartment, but a mechanical device with levers and gears. I pressed the central gear, and a low rumbling vibrated through the floor. One section of bookshelves slid sideways, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Jonathan's secret vault. I hesitated at the threshold, my flashlight beam disappearing into the gloom below. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, undisturbed for decades. What waited in that darkness? Evidence of long-ago crimes? Or something more dangerous? The sound of a car on the gravel driveway decided me. Thomas had returned. I had no choice but to descend. The staircase led to a small, windowless room lined with shelves and cabinets. My flashlight revealed stacks of ledgers, boxes of documents, and, most disturbingly, several small chests that I suspected contained some of Jonathan's ill-gotten gains. Working quickly, I scanned the shelves, looking for anything that might definitively link the Hargrove fortune to piracy and murder. A leather-bound ledger caught my eye. Within it, Jonathan had meticulously recorded his illegal activities, complete with dates, ships attacked, cargoes seized, and occasionally, obstacles removed. I photographed pages with my phone, working methodically despite my racing heart. Above, I could hear faint footsteps moving through the house. Thomas, searching for me. In a locked drawer, the lock yielded easily to Eleanor's key. I found the most damning evidence of all, a confession, written in Jonathan's own hand, detailing the murder of his brother Charles, Elizabeth's death, and his subsequent cover-up. The document was clearly intended as insurance against betrayal by his conspirators, to be released only upon his death from natural causes. As I photographed the confession, the quality of light in the vault changed. My flashlight beam remained steady, but another illumination now filled the space, a faint, bluish glow emanating from the staircase. The chandelier had awakened. I gathered the most important documents into a small portfolio I found on a desk, then moved cautiously toward the stairs. The blue light grew stronger as I ascended, painting the walls with an otherworldly radiance. At the top of the stairs, I paused, listening. The house had gone silent. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards. Either Thomas had left again, or he was waiting, equally still, equally attentive. I slipped from the vault into the library, clutching the portfolio to my chest. The blue light spilled under the door from the foyer beyond. I had two choices: remain hidden in the library until daylight, or confront whatever waited beneath the chandelier. Margaret's words echoed in my mind: the chandelier shows truth, but not always completely. If I was to understand what really happened in this house, what was still happening, I needed to see what the chandelier revealed. Drawing a deep breath, I opened the library door and stepped into the foyer. The sight that greeted me stole my breath away. The chandelier blazed with blue-white light, far brighter than before. Beneath it stood not just one or two phantom figures, but a dozen or more, a parade of Oak Ridge Manor's past inhabitants, each caught in their own moment of high emotion or significance. Elizabeth arguing with Jonathan near the stairs. A young woman in 1920s clothing weeping as she read a telegram. A man in Civil War uniform bidding farewell to his family. Scenes of joy, grief, rage, and terror, all playing out simultaneously in overlapping tableaus. And moving among these phantoms, solid and real, was Thomas Blackwell. He hadn't seen me yet. His attention was fixed on the spectral panorama, his expression a mixture of awe and calculation. In his hand, he still clutched the knife. I pressed myself against the wall, watching as he approached the vision of Elizabeth and Jonathan. Unlike me, he showed no fear of standing beneath the chandelier. Indeed, he seemed drawn to it, as if communing with the power it contained. "Show me," he commanded, his voice echoing strangely in the charged atmosphere. "Show me where she hid it." The visions shifted, fragments realigning. Now Elizabeth stood alone, removing something from her bodice, a folded document, and concealing it behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The current-day fireplace, I noted, had been remodeled, the original brickwork covered by marble. Thomas smiled triumphantly and turned toward the parlor where the fireplace stood. It was then that he saw me, half hidden in the shadow of the library doorway. His smile twisted into something ugly. "Catherine, I thought you might return." Hargrove women always were too curious for their own good. He moved toward me, knife raised. I backed away, clutching the portfolio of evidence. "It's over, Thomas," I said, with more confidence than I felt. "I found Jonathan's confession. I know everything." "You know nothing," he spat. "A few old documents won't undo generations of power and influence." Who would believe you? A distant relative suddenly appearing to claim her inheritance with wild tales of ancient crimes? He lunged forward. I dodged, but not quickly enough. The knife sliced across my upper arm, drawing blood. I cried out in pain and stumbled backward, dropping the portfolio. Documents scattered across the floor. Thomas advanced, kicking the papers aside. "The chandelier has protected our secrets for over a century. It shows what we wanted to show, reveals what we needed to reveal. Did you think you were the first to try using it against us?" "The chandelier shows truth," I insisted, echoing Margaret's words. "You can't control it." "Can't I?" Thomas laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Jonathan learned to direct its power before he died. He passed that knowledge to his son, who passed it to his son, and so on down to me. We are its masters, not its victims." As if in response to his words, the chandelier's light intensified, the blue glow taking on a reddish tinge at its edges. The visions below became more chaotic, scenes shifting and blending into one another with increasing speed. Thomas raised his hands toward the chandelier in a gesture that looked almost like worship. "Show her," he commanded. "Show her what happens to those who threaten the Hargrove legacy." The visions coalesced into a single scene, my Aunt Eleanor alone in the guest house, clutching her chest as she collapsed to the floor. But something was wrong with the image. It rippled and distorted, as if the chandelier struggled to maintain it. "You see?" Thomas said, misinterpreting my expression. "Your aunt's death was no accident. Neither was your parents' car crash 20 years ago, when they got too close to the truth. And now—" He never finished the sentence. At that moment, the chandelier emitted a high-pitched tone that made both of us cover our ears in pain. The crystals vibrated violently, creating a cascade of rainbows across the walls. From the chaotic light emerged a single, clear figure, Elizabeth Hargrove, wearing the blue gown I'd seen in previous visions. But unlike before, she appeared solid, almost corporeal. Her eyes, fixed on Thomas, blazed with determination. "Enough," she said, her voice echoing with unnatural resonance. "No more lies. No more deaths." Thomas stared in shock. "Impossible," he whispered. "You can't, the chandelier doesn't." Elizabeth raised her hand, and the scattered documents at Thomas's feet rose into the air, swirling around him like leaves in a whirlwind. "The chandelier shows truth," she said, her voice growing stronger. "All truth. Including yours, Thomas Blackwell." The whirling papers created a new vision, Thomas himself entering my aunt's house late at night, replacing her heart medication with identical-looking pills. Thomas at a garage, tampering with brake lines on a car I somehow knew belonged to my parents. "No," Thomas shouted, slashing at the papers with his knife. I command you to stop. But the chandelier's power had grown beyond his control. The crystals spun faster, the light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I felt a strange connection forming between myself, Elizabeth's apparition, and the chandelier itself, a trinity of shared blood and purpose. Elizabeth turned to me, her expression softening. Take what you need, she said. In this, understanding flowed through me. I reached into my pocket and withdrew the glass cutter Margaret had given me. Not to destroy the chandelier, as she'd suggested, but to claim it. I stepped forward, directly beneath the massive fixture. Thomas lunged at me one last time, but Elizabeth's phantom form interposed itself between us. Though insubstantial, her presence seemed to confuse and disorient him. This ends now, I said, raising the glass cutter toward the central crystal, the eye of memory that had reunited with its parent structure. Thomas screamed in rage and fear. You don't understand what you're doing. The chandelier is bound to us, to the Hargrove bloodline. You can't. I am a Hargrove, I replied, the truth of it resonating through me. Elizabeth's blood runs in my veins, and I choose to end this cycle. With a single, decisive movement, I cut the central crystal free from its setting. It fell into my outstretched hand, warm and pulsing with energy. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The chandelier's light flared blindingly bright, then began to fade. The phantom figures, including Elizabeth, grew transparent. Thomas fell to his knees, clutching his head as if in terrible pain. What have you done? He gasped. Broken the connection, I answered, closing my fingers around the crystal. Without this, the chandelier is just crystal and metal. Its power is in my hands now. The room grew darker as the chandelier's light continued to dim. Thomas collapsed fully to the floor, his breathing shallow and labored. I didn't understand what was happening to him, but I suspected that generations of Blackwells had become too dependent on the chandelier's power, perhaps even sustained by it in some way. Elizabeth's form was the last to fade. Before she disappeared completely, she smiled at me and nodded once, acknowledgement, approval, release. Then she was gone, and I stood alone in the darkened foyer. Thomas lay unmoving on the floor, but whether unconscious or dead, I couldn't tell. The scattered documents remained, physical proof of the Blackwell family's crimes. In my hand, the central crystal continued to pulse with a faint light, as if awaiting instruction. I knew instinctively that it contained the chandelier's essence, its memory, its power, its truth. What I would do with that power, I wasn't yet certain. But as the first light of dawn filtered through the windows of Oakridge Manor, I knew that the house's longest night had finally ended, and that mine was just beginning. 3 months later, I stood in the foyer of Oakridge Manor, watching as workers carefully removed the chandelier from its ceiling mount. The massive fixture descended slowly on a mechanical winch, crystal teardrops tinkling softly as they caught the afternoon sunlight. Careful with that, I instructed the foreman. It's going to the Virginia Historical Society, not the dump. The man nodded, directing his team to secure the chandelier in its custom-built crate. Quite the piece of history, ma'am. Must be worth a fortune. Its value isn't monetary, I replied, but I didn't elaborate further. How could I explain what the chandelier had witnessed, what it had contained, what it had almost become? The central crystal, the eye of memory, hung around my neck on a silver chain, concealed beneath my blouse. I'd worn it constantly since that night, studying its properties, learning its secrets. Without it, the chandelier was indeed just crystal and metal, as I told Thomas. Beautiful, but inert. Thomas Blackwell had survived our confrontation, though the experience had altered him fundamentally. He'd suffered what doctors called a massive stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed and unable to speak coherently. The authorities had accepted my story of an intruder attacking both of us, especially when the evidence I gathered from the vault revealed the extent of the Blackwell family's historical crimes. The investigation that followed had been extensive and far-reaching. Generations of influence unraveled as financial records were examined, old cases reopened, connections scrutinized. Several prominent family members faced charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy. The Blackwell empire, built on Jonathan Hargrove's blood money, was crumbling. I'd kept my promise to Elizabeth, to my Aunt Eleanor, to all those who had suffered because of the Hargrove legacy. The truth had finally emerged into the light, like the chandelier now being carefully maneuvered through the front door. "Miss Hargrove?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to find Detective Laura Chin standing in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. She'd been the lead investigator on the case, initially skeptical of my claims, but eventually convinced by the mountain of evidence. "Detective, I didn't expect to see you today." "Just following up," she said, stepping into the foyer. Her eyes tracked the chandelier's progress outside. "So you're really donating it?" I nodded. "It belongs in a museum. People should know its history, the real history, not the Blackwell version." Chen's gaze sharpened. "And you're certain it's just a chandelier? After everything you told me about it showing visions, containing memories." I met her eyes steadily. We had this conversation before. Chen didn't disbelieve me. She'd seen too much evidence of the Blackwell family's crimes to dismiss my story entirely, but the supernatural elements remained a sticking point. I'd been careful about how much I revealed, describing the chandelier's properties in terms of psychological suggestion rather than actual ghostly phenomena. "It's a symbol," I said finally, "of everything that happened in this house. Its power was in what it represented, not in the object itself." Chen nodded slowly, though I could tell she remained unconvinced. "And you're staying here? After everything?" "I'm renovating," I replied, gesturing to the construction equipment visible through the windows. "Opening up the space, letting in more light. The house needs it." What I didn't tell her was that I was also systematically removing every trace of Jonathan Hargrove's influence. The renovations went beyond mere aesthetics. They were a cleansing, a reclaiming. "Well," Chen said, "I just wanted to let you know that we've closed the investigation into your aunt's death. The toxicology reports confirmed tampering with her medication, consistent with your testimony." She hesitated. "I'm sorry we can't prove who did it. With Thomas Blackwell's condition." "I understand," I said quietly. "At least now everyone knows it wasn't natural causes." Chen nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. We found something interesting in the Blackwell family archives. A tradition passed down through generations of firstborn sons. Each was given a crystal, similar to the one you described, on their 18th birthday. They were told it was a key to power and sworn to secrecy. My hand unconsciously moved to my chest, where the crystal rested against my skin. What happened to these crystals?" "That's just it. We can't find any. Not a single one. According to the diaries we recovered, each son was instructed to return his crystal to the family patriarch before his death, who would then pass it to the next generation. Perhaps they were destroyed," I suggested. "Or hidden somewhere we haven't discovered yet." Chen studied me intently. "Perhaps. Or perhaps they were reabsorbed into something larger, something that's now on its way to a museum. After she left, I walked through the partially demolished interior of Oak Ridge Manor. Walls had been removed, ceilings raised, windows enlarged. The dark, oppressive atmosphere was giving way to something lighter, more open. Margaret Fleming, who had become a close friend, called it healing the house. In the library, the one room I'd left largely untouched, I settled into the familiar wingback chair and removed the crystal from beneath my blouse. In daylight, it appeared ordinary, just a teardrop-shaped piece of cut glass. But as I held it in my palm, I felt the now familiar warmth, the subtle pulse that matched my heartbeat. I'd discovered in the weeks following that night that the crystal retained the chandelier's power of memory. When held in darkness, it could still project visions, smaller, more controlled, but just as vivid. I'd used this ability to uncover additional evidence against the Blackwells, viewing scenes from the past that revealed hiding places, conversations, conspiracies. But the crystal had shown me personal histories as well. My Aunt Eleanor's desperate research. My birth parents' discovery of their connection to Elizabeth Hargrove. The accident that had claimed their lives, no accident at all, but a calculated murder ordered by Thomas's father. And most precious of all, Elizabeth herself, not as a victim, but as a woman of courage and determination who had discovered her husband's crimes and tried to expose them even at the cost of her own life. The crystal had allowed me to know her, to understand her. In some inexplicable way, to become her heir in more than just blood. A knock at the front door roused me from my contemplation. I tucked the crystal back beneath my blouse and went to answer it. Margaret stood on the porch, a basket of garden vegetables in her arms. "Thought you might like some fresh produce," she said, stepping inside. "My tomatoes are coming in beautifully this year." I thanked her and led the way to the kitchen, now bright and airy, with new appliances and wide windows overlooking the back gardens. "The chandelier's gone, I see," Margaret observed as we passed through the foyer. "On its way to the Historical Society," I confirmed. "Though not all of it." Margaret's eyes dropped to my chest, where the crystal lay hidden. "You kept the eye." "I had to," I said simply. "It's too powerful to display publicly, too dangerous to leave unguarded. And too valuable to destroy," Margaret added softly. I didn't respond immediately. The truth was, I had tried to destroy the crystal once, in a moment of fear about its potential. I'd taken a hammer to it, only to find the tool slip from my grasp at the last moment, as if repelled by an invisible force. The crystal had chosen me, it seemed, as much as I had chosen it. "Have you learned to control it?" Margaret asked as we arranged her vegetables on the counter. "Mostly," I replied. "It responds to my thoughts, my intentions. It shows me what I need to see, not just what I want to see." "And the visions? Are they still as vivid?" I nodded. "But contained now, limited to the crystal itself rather than projecting throughout the house. And I've discovered something else, something Elizabeth began to understand before she died." Margaret raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The crystal doesn't just show the past," I explained. "Under certain conditions, usually during the full moon, it can show possibilities. Branching paths. Things that might have been or might yet be." "The future?" Margaret looked alarmed. "Not exactly. More like potential. As if time isn't a straight line but a river with countless tributaries." I paused, unsure how to articulate what I'd experienced. "Last night, I saw myself leaving this place, selling it, trying to forget. And in that vision, The Blackwell influence resurged, the truth was buried again, and the cycle continued. And that's why you're staying, Margaret said, understanding dawning in her eyes. To ensure the break is permanent. Someone has to remember, I replied. Someone has to stand guard. We continued our conversation over tea, discussing the renovations, the ongoing legal proceedings against the Blackwell family, my plans for the estate. As evening approached, Margaret prepared to leave. At the door, she turned to me with a serious expression. Catherine, I've been meaning to ask, have you experienced any side effects from your connection to the crystal? I hesitated. There had been changes, subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable. Heightened intuition. Dreams so vivid they seemed like memories. Moments when I felt as if I existed in multiple time frames simultaneously. Nothing concerning, I said finally. Why do you ask? Margaret's gaze was penetrating. Because Eleanor feared this might happen. The crystal choosing a new guardian, creating a new bond. She worried it might be too much for anyone to bear alone. I'm not alone, I replied. I have you. And Elizabeth, in a way. Margaret didn't seem reassured. Just be careful. Power like that, it changes people. After she left, I wandered through the house, checking on the day's construction progress. The workers had gone, leaving behind the ordered chaos of renovation, drop cloths, tools, materials stacked in corners. In less than 6 months, Oak Ridge Manor would be transformed, its dark history literally covered with new walls, new floors, new purpose. As darkness fell, I returned to the library and lit a single lamp. The crystal seemed to pulse more strongly against my skin, responding to the fading light. I removed it from its chain and held it in my palm. Show me, I whispered, concentrating on Elizabeth's face, her voice, her spirit. The crystal glowed, its inner light spilling between my fingers. Above my open hand, a miniature vision formed, Elizabeth in her blue gown, standing in this very library. Her expression was solemn but peaceful. We've done it, I told her phantom. The truth is out. The Blackwells are finished. Elizabeth's image smiled, but there was something sad in her eyes, something knowing. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite hear. What is it? I asked, leaning closer. What are you trying to tell me? The vision expanded, showing not just Elizabeth but the chandelier as it had once been, whole and magnificent. Beneath it stood a succession of figures, Jonathan Hargrove, his son, grandson, great-grandson, all the way to Thomas Blackwell. Each held a crystal identical to mine. Each looked upward with the same expression of reverence and hunger. I understood then what Elizabeth was warning me about. The crystal's power had seduced the Hargroves and Blackwells across generations. Each had believed they controlled it, when in fact it had controlled them, influenced them, corrupted them, bound them to its purpose. Was I following the same path? Had I kept the crystal out of necessity, as I claimed, or out of desire for its power? The vision shifted again, showing me as I might become isolated in this house, suspicious of outsiders, jealously guarding my secret. Just as Eleanor had been. Just as every guardian before her had been. No, I said firmly, closing my fingers around the crystal. I won't let that happen. I'm not like them. The vision disappeared, the crystal's light dimming between my clenched fingers. But Elizabeth's warning lingered in my mind. The crystal was not just a tool or weapon, it was a test. Of my character, my resilience, my humanity. I reopened my hand, studying the innocent-looking teardrop of crystal. So much power in such a small object. So much potential for good or ill. The renovations would continue. The house would be transformed. The Blackwell legacy would fade into history. But some things, some choices, remained constant across time. I could destroy the crystal and its influence forever. Or I could keep it, use it, learn from it, while always remaining vigilant against its cell corruption. As I stood in the darkened library, the crystal casting fractured light across the bookshelves, I made my decision. Not final, perhaps, such decisions rarely are, but clear enough for now. I replaced the crystal on its chain and fastened it around my neck. Its weight settled against my skin, familiar and foreign at once. A responsibility. A burden. A legacy. Outside, clouds parted, revealing a full moon that sent silver light streaming through the windows. The crystal responded, its inner glow intensifying. In its depths, I glimpsed fleeting images, not of the past this time, but of possibilities. Paths I might take. Choices I might make. Futures I might create or prevent. The chandelier was gone, its power dispersed. But its heart remained, beating against my own. And in that conjunction of blood and crystal, past and present, memory and possibility, I found my purpose. I would be the guardian this time. Not of secrets, but of truth. Not of power, but of justice. Not of shadows, but of light. Elizabeth had started this journey over a century and a half ago. My Aunt Eleanor had continued it. Now it fell to me to complete it, to ensure that the chandelier's final vision would be one of healing, not horror. I closed my eyes, feeling the crystal's warmth spread through me. When I opened them again, I was alone in the library. No visions, no phantoms, no echoes of the past. Just a woman in an old house, holding a small piece of crystal that had witnessed generations of darkness and light. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. For now. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.